For scraps of love. The last gift my husband ever made was still safe, sewn into the lining of a blanket everyone in that room had already decided was worthless. I want you to know that before the story even starts, begging for scraps of love, because I've earned the right to tell you things out of order. My son's voice on the phone that night was not a voice I recognized. "Mom," he said, and it cracked clean down the middle like a plate dropped on tile. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What was actually inside that blanket? I was standing in my kitchen with the porch light off and my husband's reading chair empty behind me, and I let the question sit in the air for a moment before I answered it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because some questions deserve to be felt before they're solved. Welcome to Alpha Mom Stories, where the gift the world calls cheap is usually the only thing in the room money never touched. Stay until the end of begging for scraps of love, because this isn't just a story about a blanket in a trash can. It's a story about a house, a signature, and a woman my family decided, all at once and very quietly, for scraps of love. Wasn't sharp enough to notice what they were doing to her. They were wrong about that in ways they are still finding out. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 70 years old, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and for 35 years I worked as a textile and estate appraiser, first for an auction house downtown and later on my own. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, driving out to old farmhouses and paid-off row homes to tell families what their mother's quilts and their grandfather's pocket watches were actually worth before the estate sale vultures got to them. Of begging for scraps of love. People think appraising is one skill. It isn't. It's two, running side by side like rails on a track. And if you only ever learn one of them, you're not an appraiser. You're just a man with a price gun, begging for scraps of love. The first rail is the easy one. You learn to read a garment the way a doctor reads an x-ray, the tightness of a seam, the weight of a wool. Of begging for scraps of love, the difference between a hand-turned hem and one run through a machine that didn't care. I can tell you what a coat cost within $20 just by holding the cuff. Of begging for scraps of love. That's the skill everyone assumes an appraiser has. The second rail is the one that actually matters, and it's the one nobody teaches you in a course. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You learn to read what a thing is worth to the person who's about to lose it, separate entirely from what it would fetch at auction. Of begging for scraps of love. I have held up a chipped teacup worth $4 at any sale in the country and watched a grown man weep because his mother drank her coffee from it every single morning of his childhood for scraps of love, and I've watched families argue for an hour over a diamond ring that was, by every honest measure, worth less than the argument itself. A stitch tells you the cost. It never tells you the worth. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I used to say that to clients standing in dead parents' living rooms trying to decide what to keep. I said it so many times it stopped being a sentence and became a kind of compass I carried around inside me. For scraps of love, one I trusted more than my own eyes most days. I would need that compass more than I ever imagined, in a room full of my own family over a blanket I made with my own two ruined hands. My hands aren't what they were. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The arthritis found me about 6 years ago, slow at first the way water finds a crack in a foundation, and then all at once the way the whole wall goes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There are mornings now when my fingers won't close around anything smaller than a coffee mug until I've run them under hot water for a while and talk to them like they're stubborn children who don't want to get out of bed. Of begging for scraps of love. I tell you this not for your sympathy. I tell you this so that later, when I tell you what those hands made anyway, and how long it took, you understand exactly what it cost me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And why I paid it without hesitating for 1 second. Let me tell you about Walter, because none of what happened makes any sense without him. My husband was not a man who announced things. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He drove the same gray pickup truck for 21 years and patched the seat with electrical tape rather than replace it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because the truck still ran and the seat still held him, and Walter Whitfield did not see the sense in fixing what wasn't broken just because it had gotten old. He worked 38 years at the same regional bank. Of begging for scraps of love, starting as a teller and retiring as a branch manager. Nobody remembers being flashy about anything, ever. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He was the kind of man who noticed the new hire looked thin around payday and slipped an extra 20 into a birthday card without a word about it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and if you thanked him, he'd wave it off like you'd caught him doing something slightly embarrassing. Walter thought in decades, that's the plainest way I can put it, of begging for scraps of love. Other men his age bought boats they'd use 4 times a summer, or trucks bigger than the ones they already had. Walter bought small, unglamorous things and let time do the heavy lifting for him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Time's the only thing that pays interest on patience, Elle, he used to say, usually while I was rolling my eyes at him for turning down a vacation to instead top off some account I only half understood. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What I did not fully understand, not until the very end, was exactly how long he'd been planning for a person who didn't exist yet. We wanted grandchildren for a long time before we got them, begging for scraps of love. Our son Daniel married late, and it took him and his wife a while to have their first. And in all those waiting years, Walter never once stopped preparing for a baby that might never come. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He talked about it on the porch some evenings, the fishing trips he'd take a grandson on, the terrible dad jokes he'd inflict on a granddaughter until she groaned and loved him anyway. He never got to meet that child. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 11 months before the shower where everything happened, Walter's heart simply set down its tools on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a hospital room with fluorescent lights and a view of a parking garage, of begging for scraps of love. And by evening, I was a woman with a house that had gone strangely, permanently quiet. But here is the thing about a man who thinks in decades. He doesn't stop preparing just because the end is close. After scraps of love, he gears of begging more precise about it. About a week before Walter died, when we both understood what was coming and had stopped pretending otherwise, of begging for scraps of love, he asked Motme to bring him a battered wooden cigar box that had sat on the top shelf of his closet for as long as I'd known him. I had seen that box for over 30 years and never once opened it. I'd assumed 10 years of begging for scraps of love, if I thought about it at all, that it held receipts or his father's old military pins or the specific kind of nothing a man keeps because throwing it away would feel like erasing something. For scraps of love, it was full of savings bonds, stacks of them, rubber banded by year going back nearly 3 decades, $10 here, $50 there, bought a little at a time on birthdays and good months and Christmas bonuses, begging for scraps of love for a grandchild who did not exist yet and might never. On the inside of the lid in Walter's blocky pencil handwriting, it said, "For our first grandbaby." Started the year Daniel turned 9. Walter told me 10 years of begging for scraps of love, his voice already thinning but his eyes still perfectly clear, that he'd figured someday there'd be a little one and he'd wanted to hand them a head start that nobody could ever take away from them, of begging for scraps of love. He squeezed my hand with what strength he had left. "They've matured now, Elle, 30 years. It's real money." I asked him how much. He told me, and I will not make you wait for it the way my family had to, of begging for scraps of love. It came to just under $52,000. But then Walter told me the part that mattered more than the number, the part I have replayed every single day since. "Don't just hand it to them in an envelope," he said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Money in an envelope, they'll spend it on a stroller and forget where it came from inside a year. Put it somewhere they have to keep. Sew it in. Make her open the blanket. Make it last. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That was very nearly the last coherent instruction my husband gave me on this earth, and I intended to carry it out exactly, to the letter, no matter what it cost my hands or my heart to do it. So I knitted a blanket. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I started the week after the funeral, partly for the baby who was still 4 months from arriving, and partly, if I'm honest with you, because my hands needed something to do besides shake in an empty house. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Cream-colored wool, soft as a held breath, with a border of small blue sailboats worked around the edge. 10 years of beg for scraps of love. Because Walter had loved the water and had promised a grandchild he'd never meet a lifetime of fishing trips he'd never get to take. In one corner, small enough that you'd have to be looking for it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I knitted his initials, W, so that some piece of him would be present in that nursery for every nap, every fever, every 3 a.m. that a new mother has to survive alone. It took me 4 months. Of begging for scraps of love, my hands made me pay in full for every single row. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table crying, not from the pain in my knuckles, but from the missing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the particular ache of doing something for a man who would never see it finished. But I finished it. Years of begging for scraps of love, and I will tell you without an ounce of false modesty that it was the most beautiful thing I have ever made in my life. And then I did the real work. On the underside, years of begging for scraps of love. Using the same hidden seam technique I'd used for decades to stitch cash and travel documents into coat linings for clients who didn't trust hotel safes, I sewed a flat interior pocket of begging for scraps of love, invisible unless you knew exactly where to run your fingers. Into that pocket, I folded every one of Walter's bonds, 30 years of patience rubber banded together, and one more thing, a letter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Walter had dictated it to me in that hospital room, pausing between sentences to breathe, making me read it back twice to be sure I'd gotten every word right. A letter to a grandchild he would never meet, of begging for scraps of love, about who their grandfather had been and what he'd hoped for them, sealed in an envelope marked in my own careful hand this time, to be opened at 18. Love, Grandpa Walter. Of begging for scraps of love. I folded the bonds and the letter into that hidden pocket and stitched it closed, neat and completely invisible. $52,000 and a dying man's last words, of begging for scraps of love, sewn with love into something a young woman was about to call cheap in front of 20 people and a camera. I should tell you about Vanessa now because I don't want her to be a cartoon in this story. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She's more complicated than that, and the complication is the sad part. My daughter-in-law grew up the only daughter of a woman named Diane, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who has spent her entire life measuring the world in labels and square footage. I've met Diane on more occasions than I'd like, and every single time within the first 15 minutes of begging for scraps of love, she has found a way to mention what something cost, her coat, her countertops, the private school she'd wanted for Vanessa but couldn't quite manage, begging for scraps of love. Vanessa was raised inside that measuring system so completely that she doesn't experience it as a choice anymore. She believes in the marrow of her that the worth of a thing, a car, a coat, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a person, is printed somewhere on it in small type, and that the worst possible fate that can befall a woman is to be mistaken for something common. What almost nobody in the family remembers, begging for scraps of love, or perhaps has simply chosen to forget, is that Vanessa did not start out this way. 9 years ago, before she ever met my son, of begging for scraps of love, Vanessa ran a tiny vintage clothing shop out of a storefront 2 blocks from my old appraisal office, restoring and reselling secondhand garments other people had discarded. The exact instinct of begging for scraps of love. I've often thought since that the woman at that baby shower had spent years training herself out of. I used to walk past on my lunch break and watch her through the window, of begging for scraps of love, mending torn hems with more care than they probably deserved, and I liked her for it before I ever knew her name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Her landlord raised the rent without warning the same month her mother needed an expensive medical procedure, and Vanessa was 3 weeks from losing the shop entirely. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I know this because I happened to be in the building next door doing an estate walkthrough when I overheard her on the phone, trying and failing to hold her voice steady with the landlord's office. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did something I've never told a single soul, not even Walter, until years later. I made an anonymous payment covering 3 months of back rent through the landlord's office, of begging for scraps of love, using a cashier's check with no name attached, and I kept the receipt in an old ledger I still have, tucked into a drawer in my sewing room. 10 years of begging for scraps of love because some habits from decades of appraising other people's paperwork never leave you. Vanessa never knew where the money came from. Of begging for scraps of love. The shop survived long enough for her to sell it 2 years later for a modest profit, seed money as it turned out, for the polished. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Curated life she built after that, the life that would eventually teach her to look in nothing but an embarrassment. I want you to hold on to that fact quietly, the way I did for years, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it matters enormously for what I decided to do later when the woman I'd once saved without asking for a single thing in return turned around and helped plan the theft of everything I had left. For scraps of love. I should also tell you about my son Daniel because the part of this story that still aches even now isn't Vanessa, it's him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Daniel is a good man who has spent his entire life avoiding conflict the way some people avoid heights, with a real physical dread that overrides his better judgment every time. He's gentle and funny in a quiet way of begging for scraps of love. And he loved his father fiercely, and somewhere in the process of falling for Vanessa, he learned to go quiet himself, agreeing, smoothing things over, choosing whatever kept the peace in the room. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, even when the peace cost him something. When Diane redecorated her daughter's entire worldview around labels and appearances, Daniel simply went along with it, because going along was easier than the alternative. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and Daniel, more than almost anyone I have ever known, has always chosen easier. After his father died, Daniel came apart the way quiet men do, privately, in ways designed not to inconvenience anyone else. For scraps of love, he'd call me some nights just to talk about Walter, about nothing in particular, really, just to hear a voice that remembered his father the same way he did, of begging for scraps of love. He kept one of Walter's old flannel shirts hanging on a hook by his own front door months after the funeral, though he never explained why and I never asked. He knew, better than anyone in that family, exactly who his father had been, which is precisely why, when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't break Vanessa. Vanessa deflected the way she deflects everything. It broke Daniel, of begging for scraps of love, because Daniel was standing 3 feet away when it happened, and Daniel said nothing. But I'm getting ahead of the story. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and there's a great deal you need to understand first about what had already been happening in that family for months before anyone ever touched that blanket. Things I only pieced together myself slowly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, using exactly the 2 rails of my old training because nobody handed me the truth. I had to appraise it out of 100 small, careless details the way I'd been doing for other families my entire working life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had simply never expected to have to do it for my own. It started small the way these things always do about 4 months after Walter's funeral. Vanessa and Daniel began coming by more often than they used to. Of begging for scraps of love, which I welcomed at first, grieving as I was, glad for the company in a house that had gotten too quiet too fast. But the visits had a particular quality to them that I couldn't name for a while. Of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa would wander the downstairs rooms while we talked, running a hand along the mantel, commenting on how much space I had for just one person, how much upkeep a house this size must be for someone my age. Of begging for scraps of love. Wasn't it exhausting, really, keeping up a place like this all alone? Diane started joining them on Sunday afternoons, uninvited but somehow never quite turned away, and her comments ran along the same seam. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Over and over, gentle as a hand-smoothing fabric the wrong direction. Had I thought about downsizing, there were some lovely communities not 15 minutes from here. She'd toured one just last week with a friend. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The amenities were really something I ought to at least look. I am not whatever my family had apparently begun to assume. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A woman who misses a pattern when it's repeated to her 4 separate times by 3 different people inside of 6 weeks. I'd spent 35 years walking into houses and reading within minutes of begging for scraps of love. Exactly which relative in the room was there for the grief and which one was there for the estate. I recognized the shape of what was happening to me long before I had any proof of it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and so I did what I have always done when I suspect something and can't yet confirm it. I watched and I said almost nothing, and I let them believe I hadn't noticed a thing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The first real proof came on an ordinary Tuesday in early spring, at a coffee shop 2 blocks from my house where I'd gone to escape the quiet of my own kitchen for an hour. Of begging for scraps of love. I was seated in a corner booth with a crossword I wasn't actually solving when I heard Diane's voice, unmistakable even at a low register, coming from a table behind a display of pastries. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She was speaking with a woman I didn't recognize, someone brisk and businesslike, of begging for scraps of love, who kept referring to the capacity route and the filing window. in a tone so casual it took me a full minute to understand she wasn't discussing anything to do with plumbing or construction. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The word guardianship arrived in the conversation, like a stone dropped into still water, and I sat perfectly motionless behind my crossword and listened to a stranger explain to my daughter-in-law's mother, begging for scraps of love, in the calm professional cadence of someone who has done this many times before, exactly how a documented pattern of concerning incidents could be built, slowly and quietly, over a period of weeks, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and exactly how quickly a competency evaluation could be scheduled once a family attorney filed the right petition. The stranger, I would later learn her name was Pamela Voss and that she styled herself of begging for scraps of love on a business card I eventually got hold of as a senior transition consultant, mentioned a date, October the 14th. She said it the way you'd mention a dentist appointment, of begging for scraps of love, and Diane nodded like she already knew, and I sat there with my coffee going cold and did the arithmetic in my head before I'd even finished my crossword clue. 19 days. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than the shock. I felt something close to relief, of begging for scraps of love, not because the news was good, God knows it wasn't, but because for months I had been carrying a suspicion with no shape to it, and suspicion without shape is its own particular kind of exhausting. Now I had a shape. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Now I had a date, and a woman who has spent 35 years reading rooms for a living does not fall apart when she finally gets the one piece of information she'd been missing. She gets to work. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not confront Diane in that coffee shop. I did not confront anyone, not that week, not the next. I finished my crossword, paid for my coffee, and walked home along the same route I always take. 10 years of begging scraps of love. And somewhere between the coffee shop and my own front door, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I was not going to let them see me coming. Whatever they thought a woman my age, freshly widowed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, quietly forgetful's imagination was capable of noticing, I intended to prove wrong at a time and in a manner entirely of my own choosing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Walter used to say that the surest way to lose a negotiation was to let the other side know you understood the terms before you were ready to use that understanding. Of begging for scraps of love, I had listened to him say it for 43 years without ever once needing to apply it myself. My education was about to begin in earnest. That same week, I called my late husband's attorney, a careful 10 years of begging for scraps of love, silver-haired man named Arthur Castellano, who had drawn up our wills decades earlier and had known Walter since they were young men playing cards on Friday nights. I did not tell him everything. Of begging for scraps of love. I told him I wanted to understand my options for protecting the house quietly in a way that could not easily be undone by anyone but me. He listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And then he asked me one question that I have thought about many times since. Eleanor, he said, is there someone specific you're protecting this from? I told him I wasn't sure yet, of begging for scraps of love, but that I intended to be sure very soon, and that when I was, I would need him ready to move quickly. He said he would be. I believed him, and it turned out I was right to. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to pause here and tell you something Walter used to say to me on the porch, back when Daniel was still small and none of this was even a shadow on the horizon yet. A house isn't 4 walls, Elle, he'd say. Of begging for scraps of love, it's every decision a person made inside it, stacked up over the years until you can't tell the wood from the choices anymore. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I was sitting alone in that same house 19 days, from a hearing date I wasn't supposed to know about. Years of begging for scraps of love. Holding a cigar box of bonds meant for a grandchild I hadn't met yet, understanding for the first time in my life exactly how much a person can lose without a single item ever technically leaving the room. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The baby shower invitation arrived on heavy cardstock with gold foil edges about 6 weeks later. Vanessa's garden soiree, it read, with a dress code printed underneath in a delicate script, of begging for scraps of love. As though a baby shower required formal attire the way a wedding might. I want to tell you I felt only dread reading it, given everything I already knew, but that isn't entirely true. in for scraps of love. Somewhere underneath the caution I was carrying like a second skin by then, there was still a grandmother who was, God help her, excited. I had the most important gift in the world sitting wrapped on my dresser, of begging for scraps of love. And I had practiced in my head, more than once, exactly how the moment would unfold, Vanessa opening the blanket, my voice gentle, telling her there was something inside it, asking her to feel along the bottom seam, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Watching the whole room understand all at once that the quiet old man who couldn't be there had been planning for this child for 30 years. Make her open the blanket, Walter had said. 10 years of beg for scraps of love. I fully intended to make her open the blanket, whatever else was circling that family like weather I couldn't yet see the edges of. I bought a new blouse for the occasion, navy with a small lace collar, of begging for scraps of love, because some part of me was still determined to walk into that room looking like exactly what I was, a woman who had raised a family, buried a husband, and had absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I wrapped the gift in plain cream paper because the blanket didn't need gold foil to be precious, and I tied it with a length of blue ribbon the color of the little knitted sailboats. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I drove to Diane's house because, of course, it was at Diane's house. Every important family event in that circle happened on Diane's terrain, with the box sitting on the passenger seat where Walter used to sit, of begging for scraps of love. And I talked to him a little on the way I still do sometimes when the silence in the car gets too loud. Big day, Walter, I told him. We're finally giving them your bonds. Can you believe it? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had absolutely no idea, driving down that tree-lined street with the windows cracked and the spring air coming in, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I was less than 2 hours away from watching a stranger drop my husband's heart into a garbage can in front of 20 witnesses, and a phone held up specifically to capture it for an audience. Of begging for scraps of love, and I had even less idea that the same afternoon would end with me sitting in my parked car outside that house, doing arithmetic on 19 days that had, without my noticing exactly when, become 14. For scraps of love. Diane's house that afternoon had been rearranged into something closer to a boutique hotel than a home. White peonies stood in tall glass vases along every surface that would hold one. Years of begging for scraps of love. A balloon arch curved over the back patio in 3 shades of sage, and a table near the kitchen held rows of tiny catered things, miniature quiches, delicate cookies with the baby's name piped onto them in gold, of begging for scraps of love. Food that cost more per bite than it fed. A backdrop had been set up against the far wall, the baby's chosen name spelled out in gold script letters. Oliver, a name Vanessa had told people tested well. Of begging for scraps of love, a phrase I heard repeated twice that afternoon without anyone once explaining what exactly it had tested well against. I felt walking in with my plain cream box tucked against my hip. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, like a wren that had flown in through an open window into a room built for peacocks. Everyone was younger, glossier, dressed in clothes that seemed to already know they were about to be photographed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I found a chair near the edge of the room, the place reserved without anyone saying so for the elderly aunt, and I smiled and I settled in, and I was not, despite everything I already knew, unhappy. I had my secret of begging for scraps of love, and secrets keep you warm in a cold room better than almost anything else does. Every time a young woman in a dress worth more than my monthly grocery bill glanced at my plain box with that small for scraps of love, involuntary flicker of pity, I simply thought about the hidden pocket sewn into the lining and smiled to myself in a way that must have looked from the outside almost serene, begging for scraps of love. I want you to understand something about that hour, because out of everything that happened that day, it's the part I still grieve the most, even now. I walked into that house happy, begging for scraps of love, walked in carrying my dead husband's love for a grandchild he would never hold, ready to give it away with both hands, glad to do it, my heart wide open with no armor on at all. You don't wear armor to a baby shower. 10 years of big gift and a full heart, and you assume, foolishly perhaps, that the room will at least be kind to you in return. I was about to learn, in the space of about 90 seconds, of begging for scraps of love, that some rooms will take your whole heart, throw it in the trash, and call it content for a phone. There was a young woman near the gift table with her phone already out, filming the room in slow, practiced sweeps. Vanessa's friend Brianna, capturing footage for what I'd later learn was a fairly substantial online following built around exactly this kind of curated, aspirational domestic life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I didn't think much of it at the time. I would think a great deal about it later, when that same footage became the single most important piece of evidence I had. The gift opening was staged like a small production, begging for scraps of love. Vanessa sat in a wide white wicker chair set up beneath the balloon arch like a throne. Brianna's phone trained steadily on her from a few feet away, and Diane stood just off to the side, of begging for scraps of love, narrating for the room in a voice pitched to Carrie. "Oh, that's the Italian one," she'd say, holding up a hand toward some designer onesie. "Isn't it just gorgeous?" Vanessa lifted each gift to the camera in turn, and years of begging for scraps of love, named the brand aloud, and thanked the giver with a little wave as though the entire purpose of a present was the label attached to it, rather than anything it might actually be used for. A cashmere layette. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A diaper bag that cost, by my quiet estimate, more than I used to bring home in a month at the appraisal firm. A stroller with a name that sounded more like a sports car than something meant to hold an infant. Of begging for scraps of love. Each one held up, admired, photographed, cooed over by the room. The currency in that space was entirely visible, and I did not have a single unit of it in my possession. I watched my son from across the room. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Daniel stood near the wall with a drink he wasn't actually touching, wearing the particular smile of a man who would rather be almost anywhere else on earth. He caught my eye once briefly and gave me a small, begging for scraps of love, helpless shrug, the kind a boy gives you when he's apologizing for weather he can't control. I should have read that shrug more carefully than I did in the moment. It was the shrug of a man who already suspected of begging for scraps of love. On some level, he hadn't let himself examine that his wife was about to do something unkind, and who had already quietly decided not to stand in her way. Walter's younger sister Rosalind was there, 72, of begging for scraps of love, sharp-tongued and warm in the particular way that only people who've buried the same losses as you can manage to be. She squeezed into the folding chair beside mine partway through the gift opening and muttered, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, low enough for only me to hear, designer diaper bag. In my day, we used a canvas tote, and the baby survived just fine. I laughed, genuinely, for the first time all afternoon. She patted the top of my box. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "Is that the famous blanket?" she asked. "Walter told me what you were putting into it, before he passed, the old softy. That baby is one lucky little fish. 10 years of begging for scraps of love." I want you to remember that Rosalind knew about the bonds and that she'd known for months, because it matters enormously for what came next, and I don't want it to feel like an accident when it becomes important. Scraps of love. "You should tell Vanessa before she opens it," Rosalind whispered, "so she's careful with it." I shook my head, smiling. "Walter's orders," I told her. "Make her open it herself. I'll point her toward the seam after." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, Rosalind chuckled softly. "He always did love a bit of theater, my brother." I think about that exchange more than almost anything else from that day, because if I had simply stood up right then and announced, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, before Vanessa's hands ever touched the wrapping paper, that there was $52,000 and her father-in-law's last letter sewn inside that blanket, none of what followed would have happened. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa would have handled it like the crown jewels. There would have been no story at all. But I didn't, because I was honoring a dying man's exact wish, and because it had genuinely never occurred to me of begging for scraps of love. Not in 1,000 years that anyone alive would simply throw a handmade blanket in the garbage. Set it aside politely, maybe. Regift it eventually, even, but not that. That was a failure of my own imagination, of begging for scraps of love, and I have had to make my peace with it since. I had lived 70 years and never once met cruelty quite that casual, quite that comfortable performing itself for an audience. I hadn't known to guard against it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The pile of gifts beside Vanessa's wicker throne grew steadily, and then there were only two left on the table, a gift card in a plain envelope and my box, plain cream paper, blue ribbon, of begging for scraps of love. Diane picked it up first and read the small tag aloud. From Grandma Eleanor, she announced, in the exact gentle, condescending tone a person uses for a child's macaroni art pinned to a refrigerator. A few soft, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Indulgent laughs went around the room. Someone's phone came up a little higher. Vanessa took the box from her mother, gave the plain wrapping a quick, assessing glance. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I watched the corner of her mouth do something I recognized instantly and did not like at all. "Let's see what Grandma made," she said, and pulled the paper away. For one single moment, I let myself hope. Of begging for scraps of love. The cream paper fell open, and there it was, 4 months of my hands, the softest wool I could afford, the small blue sailboats marching neatly around the border. Of begging for scraps of love. Walter's initials tucked into the corner like a held breath. In that bright, glossy room full of things made by machines in overseas factories, my blanket looked, to my eyes at least, for scraps of love, like the only genuinely real object in the space. Vanessa held it up by two corners, the way you might hold something to check it for a stain before deciding whether to keep it. I watched her face register, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a fraction of a second, that it was handmade. That faint human unevenness in the stitching that every fashion magazine in the country currently insists is the very thing that makes an object precious. Love. I watched her decide in real time what that fact meant to her instead. Her nose wrinkled, just barely. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The micro-expression of a woman who was taught somewhere very early on that homemade is simply a polite word for poor. "Did you make this?" she asked in a voice pitched for the room rather than for me. "I did." Begging for scraps of love. "Sweetheart," I said, and my voice stayed warm, and I leaned forward to begin telling her about the seam, about Walter, about feeling along the bottom edge. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There's something rather special about, but Vanessa was already talking over me, aimed at Brianna's phone and the room beyond it. "That's so sweet," she said, begging for scraps of love, in the particular tone people use to close a conversation rather than continue one. "It's very homemade." Diane laughed her small, tinkling laugh and added, "Bless her heart." Of begging for scraps of love, and I felt the floor of the room tilt very slightly beneath me, that old familiar sensation of being made smaller in real time by people who had already decided how much space you were allowed to take up. Of begging for scraps of love, but I still did not understand even then what was actually about to happen. I thought the worst of it would be the word homemade and the bless her heart of begging for scraps of love, and that I would simply smile through it and quietly point Vanessa toward the seam later, in private, and let the bonds redeem the whole strange afternoon on their own. I was wrong about how far this particular woman, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, on this particular day, in front of this particular cameras, would prepared to take it. What happened next happened fast, and I have replayed it in slow motion more times than I could count since. Of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa folded the blanket back over one arm with a kind of small theatrical finality. She glanced around at her perfectly staged sage and gold party, at the mountain of designer gifts beside her chair, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, at the watching faces of her friends, at Brianna's steady phone, and I watched her run some private calculation, the particular social math of a woman who has learned to live for an audience rather than a room. Of begging for scraps of love. A handmade blanket did not fit the picture she had spent months building. It clashed with the aesthetic, and Vanessa had a camera rolling and a room to perform for, and somewhere in her carefully labeled measured heart, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she decided that the funny, on-brand, shareable thing to do was to turn it into a small joke. There was a tall steel trash can positioned at the end of the gift table, the nice kind, lined with a crisp white bag. Of begging for scraps of love, meant for the discarded wrapping paper. Vanessa stood, blanket still draped over one arm, and crossed to it, playing to Brianna's phone the entire way. "Okay, so," she said, laughing, "I love Grandma. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but we do have a whole aesthetic going for the nursery." She held the blanket out over the open can like a magician about to make a scarf disappear. "We only display curated things in this family," and she let go. of begging for scraps of love, my blanket, Walter's sailboats, Walter's initials, Walter's $52,000, Walter's last letter to a grandson he would never meet, dropped into a trash can on top of torn wrapping paper, begging for scraps of love. In front of 20 people, on camera, the room laughed. Not everyone, I want to be fair about that, but enough people did. The nervous of begging for scraps of love follow the leader laugh of a group that has quickly decided whoever holds the most social power in the room is the one who's currently being funny. Brianna's phone caught every second of it. Diane clapped, delighted. Years of begging for scraps of love. And my son, my Daniel, stood against the wall, went pale as chalk, opened his mouth, and closed it again without a single word coming out. That was the worst second of the entire day, and I want you to remember it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it will come back later in this story with everything it deserves, not the blanket landing in the bin. My son's mouth closing. We only display curated things in this family of begging for scraps of love. I have heard a great many unkind things in 70 years. I have been called old-fashioned, behind the times, a sweet nobody with her yarn and her small-town shop, begging for scraps of love. None of it ever landed anywhere close to those 6 words, in that bright room, with my husband's heart sitting in a garbage can 3 feet from where I sat. Of begging for scraps of love. Here's what I need you to understand about that particular moment, because it is the hinge on which the entire rest of this story turns. I had a choice. I could have stood up and shouted. Of begging for scraps of love. I could have told that foolish, frightened young woman exactly what she had just thrown away. $52,000, the last words her father-in-law ever wrote. Of begging for scraps of love, 30 years of a patient man's love folded into wool. I could have made a scene that would have lived in that family's memory forever. Part of me, the widow, the mother bear, of begging for scraps of love, the woman whose ruined hands had bled quietly into every single row of that blanket, wanted to badly. But I didn't, because in that exact second, several things were true at once. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I registered every one of them with a clarity I still find remarkable when I look back on it. The bonds and the letter were safe, sewn shut in a pocket Vanessa hadn't found and wasn't going to find by accident. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A camera was running, held by the very friend of the woman who'd just done this, which meant the truth of what had happened would keep perfectly well without any help from me. Of begging for scraps of love, and beneath both of those facts sat the one that actually decided everything. I looked at that smug, performing, frightened young woman and understood all at once, as of begging for scraps of love, that the worst possible punishment I could hand her was not a scene made in the heat of the moment. It was the truth delivered later, calmly, at a time of my choosing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, when she could no longer pretend she hadn't known exactly what she was doing, so I did the only thing left that had any real dignity in it. I stood, walked to the trash can, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and reached in to take back what belonged to me. If you have ever stood in a room full of people and watched something you made with love treated like garbage, your time, your effort, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, your heart tossed aside because it didn't arrive with the right label attached, then you already know there is a particular kind of silence that follows a moment like that. The silence of deciding in real time, of begging for scraps of love, exactly how much of yourself you're willing to defend in front of people who have already decided you're not worth much. If that silence sounds familiar to you, stay with me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because this is exactly where the story turns, and if you've ever had to choose, the way I did, between the easy tears everyone expected and the quiet you knew would actually win, begging for scraps of love, tell me in the comments below where you are watching from tonight. I read everyone. I lifted the blanket out of the trash can. A few scraps of wrapping paper clung to it. I brushed them off calmly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you'd brush crumbs off a child's shirt and folded it neatly. The way 40 years of a career spent behind counters and appraisal tables had trained my hands to fold anything without needing to think about it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I tucked it into my bag. The room had gone quiet by then. The laughter had curdled fast the way it always does once people sense they've overreached. Even Vanessa seemed to feel the wind shift. 10 years of begging for covered it quickly. "Oh, did you want it back?" she said, bright and brittle. "That's fine, take it, sorry, it's really not your kind of thing anyway." "It's all right, dear," I said, for scraps of love, and my voice was perfectly steady. "I'll keep it." And that steadiness landed on her, I could see it, far harder than anger would have. She'd braced herself for tears or a scene, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the two reactions her world had trained her to expect from a woman my age. A calm grandmother folding a blanket and saying, "I'll keep it," did not compute for her at all. "I think I'll head out," I said gently. As of begging for scraps of love, to the room in general, "Thank you for having me. Congratulations on the baby." I found Rosalind's eyes across the room, gave her a small nod, and picked up my bag with Walter folded inside it, of begging for scraps of love, and walked out of Diane's boutique hotel of a house with my back perfectly straight the entire way to the car. I did not let myself cry until the car door was closed. Once it was, of begging for scraps of love, with the glossy house shrinking in my mirror, I let myself fall apart for exactly as long as it took to feel it and no longer. I held the blanket against my chest, of begging for scraps of love, and it still smelled faintly of the trash can, banana peel, plastic, the sour edge of a garbage bag, and that, somehow, was the detail that finally undid me completely. That Walter's last gift, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, 30 years of his quiet, careful love, had spent even 90 seconds smelling like garbage because a young woman thought it would look good on a phone screen. "I'm so sorry, Walter." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I whispered into the empty passenger seat. "I should have told them sooner. I should have protected it better." Of begging for scraps of love. But here is the strange thing about grief and clarity. They can ride in the same car together without ever once getting in each other's way. By the time my tears had run their course, of begging for scraps of love, something underneath them had gone very still and very certain. The way the surface of a pond goes flat and you can suddenly see straight down to the bottom of it. I was not going to hand Vanessa those bonds. Years of begging for scraps of love, not like this. Not into hands that would call a dead man's love tacky the moment it arrived without a designer tag on it. Walter's last wish had been to make it last, to make them find it. Begging for scraps of love. To make it mean something, and you cannot hand a legacy like that to someone who throws legacies in the trash for content. It would be like pouring good wine into a cracked cup and calling it generous. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but little Oliver, who hadn't done a single thing wrong, who was innocent of every part of this, he still deserved his grandfather's gift, whole and untouched by anyone else's carelessness, is of begging for scraps of love. That much was not negotiable. Not for 1 second. Walter had saved that money for the child, not for the child's mother, so somewhere on the quiet drive home, past the same houses I'd passed 100 times before, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I started very deliberately to think like an appraiser again, not about the shape of my grief, but about how to make Walter's wish come true exactly the way he'd asked. Of begging for scraps of love, in a way no one in that family could ever throw away again. The phone was already ringing when I let myself in the front door. It wasn't Daniel, not yet. It was Rosalind, her voice tight and fast. "Eleanor," of begging for scraps of love. I should have said something. I should have stood up. "I've been sitting here shaking." "You and Daniel both," I said, not unkindly. "It's all right, Roz. I have it. It's safe." She didn't find the pocket. Of begging for scraps of love. There was a pause on the line, the kind that told me something was coming before she said it. "She doesn't know about the bonds, does she?" Rosalind said slowly. "About the letter." "No," I told her. Begging for scraps of love. "She just thinks she threw away a homemade blanket." Rosalind was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the thing that lit the fuse under everything that followed, though neither of us understood it yet. "Eleanor, it's of begging for scraps of love. I have to tell you something. After you left, I was so rattled I went and found Daniel out by the cars. I wasn't thinking." I told him. I said his father would be heartbroken, of begging for scraps of love. All those bonds finally coming due after 30 years, right there in that blanket, just like Walter wanted. Her voice caught, Eleanor, the look on his face, I don't think he knew. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "I think I just told your son what his wife threw in the garbage while he was standing right there watching." I closed my eyes and stood very still in my own kitchen. "It's all right, Roz," I said again, of begging for scraps of love, though my heart had already started aching in an entirely new direction toward my son, toward that pale, silent shape he'd made against the wall. "He went white as a sheet," Rosalind said. "He left right after, of begging for scraps of love. Didn't say a word to Vanessa, just walked out to his car. I thanked her, told her not to blame herself, and hung up. And I stood there in my kitchen, holding a blanket that still faintly smelled of garbage, understanding that somewhere across town, begging for scraps of love. My son was driving home with a piece of information detonating slowly inside him, that the blanket in the trash can had held his dead father's 30-year gift and his last written words, of begging for scraps of love, and that Daniel had stood 3 feet away and watched it happen and laughed his nervous, peacekeeping little laugh and said absolutely nothing. I filled the kettle and waited because I knew 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way only a mother knows these things, that Daniel would call. 3 minutes later, exactly as I'd expected, he did. Before I tell you about that call, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, let me tell you what I'd done in the few minutes I spent waiting for it, because it matters to everything that came after. I carried the blanket to my kitchen table and, is of begging for scraps of love, with the same seam ripper I had used 10,000 times over the course of my career, opened the hidden pocket just far enough to check, not to remove anything, only to confirm it was all still there, undamaged, of begging for scraps of love, to touch it once with my own fingers and be sure the bonds sat exactly as I'd folded them, 30 years of Walter's patience in a neat rubber-banded stack, and the letter beside them in its sealed envelope, of begging for scraps of love, to be opened at 18, "Love, Grandpa Walter," in my own steady handwriting on the front. I held that envelope for a long moment and thought about the hospital room where he'd dictated it, of begging for scraps of love, pausing for breath between sentences, making me read it back twice to be certain I'd gotten every word exactly right. He had wanted that letter to outlive him by decades. He had wanted some teenager. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, long after Walter himself had become nothing more than a photograph and a name people mentioned at holidays, to open an envelope one day and meet his grandfather for the very first time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A young woman in a garden party dress had come within one careless motion of throwing that meeting into a landfill for the sake of a laugh on camera. I refolded everything and slid it carefully back into its pocket. For scraps of love. I did not sew it shut again. Something in me already understood I would be opening it properly, and soon for the right people in the right room. Then the phone rang, and it was my son. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and his voice was already broken before he managed to say a single word. I learned the fuller shape of those minutes from Daniel himself much later, and I'll tell it to you the way he told it to me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because I think you should see that afternoon from his side, too. He said that in the awful second right after the blanket dropped, he'd fought the urge to cross the room and pull it back out himself, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and lost that fight because Vanessa was laughing and Brianna was filming, and making any kind of scene would have ruined her curated afternoon, so he'd swallowed it. Told himself it was only a blanket, of begging for scraps of love. Told himself he'd smooth things over with me privately later, the way he always smoothed things over. The old reflex, choose easier. Then Rosalind had appeared at his elbow near the cars, shaking, of begging for scraps of love, and said the words, $52,000 in bonds, your father's last letter, sewn into that blanket, exactly like Walter wanted. Daniel told me it felt like the ground had simply stopped existing under his feet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He turned back toward the trash can, which was, of course, empty by then because I had already carried the blanket to my car, and for one full, horrible minute, he genuinely believed it was gone, not misplaced, gone. Of begging for scraps of love, that his wife had thrown his father's final gift into a garbage bag that a service crew would haul to a curb within the hour, of begging for scraps of love, and that he had stood there and watched it happen and laughed his nervous little laugh while it did. He didn't confront Visa. He said he couldn't even look at her directly. He simply walked to his car, of begging for scraps of love, sat down behind the wheel in Diane's driveway and stayed there a long time with his hands shaking against the steering wheel, begging for scraps of love, doing the exact arithmetic on what he'd allowed to happen that I would later be doing myself on a very different sum from a coffee shop booth. Then he called the one person who would know for certain, his mother. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking clean across the single syllable. "Mom, please tell me you took the blanket home. Please tell me you have it." "I have it, sweetheart," I told him. "It's right here on my kitchen table." Of begging for scraps of love. "It's safe." I heard him exhale like a man surfacing from very deep water. A long, shaking breath that turned, somewhere in the middle of it, into something that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite relief either, of begging for scraps of love, but sat somewhere in between the two. "Oh, thank God," he said. "Oh, thank God." Then Roz told him what was folded inside, and there it was, the question the entire afternoon had been building toward my son, for scraps of love, sitting alone in a driveway asking what his own wife had just thrown into the trash. "Mom," he said, "what was actually inside that blanket? I could have softened it for him. God knows I considered it." 10 years of begging for scraps of love for about half a sec. But Daniel was 34 years old and a father now himself, and there are certain things a man needs to hear whole without cushioning, because the full weight of them is entirely the point. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Your father's savings bonds, Daniel, I said gently but without flinching, all of them. The ones he bought for his first grandchild a little at a time every birthday and every good month for almost 30 years. Years of begging for scraps of love. They matured this year. They're worth just over $52,000. I let that number sit in the silence between us for a moment. And his letter, I continued, the last one he ever wrote, of begging for scraps of love. He dictated it to me in the hospital, for the baby to open on his 18th birthday, so that a boy who'll never meet his grandfather can sit down someday and hear from him anyway. My voice stayed level. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, for his sake more than mine. That's what was folded inside that blanket, sweetheart. That's what your father sewed his entire heart into. That's what you watched go into a garbage can. The line went very, very quiet, as of begging for scraps of love. And then my son, my gentle, peacekeeping, conflict-avoiding son, made a sound I hadn't heard from him since he was a small boy skinning his knee on our old driveway. A raw, helpless, breaking sound. I didn't stop her. Of begging for scraps of love. "Mom," he said, "I was standing right there, and I didn't stop her. I let him cry. Sometimes that is the entirety of a mother's job in a given moment. You let them cry, and you don't rush it. Begging for scraps of love, and you don't try to fix it faster than it wants to be felt." "I keep telling myself it's just a blanket," he said, when he could finally get words out again. That's what I told myself, standing right there in that room. For scraps of love. It's just a blanket, don't make a thing of it. And it was Dad's hole. And he laughed, this small, awful, broken little laugh. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and told me he thought he was going to hear that laugh in his own head for the rest of his life. "How are you so calm?" he asked me. "How are you not falling apart right now?" Of begging for scraps of love. "I'd understand if you never spoke to either of us again, because I have it, Daniel," I told him. "Because your father's gift is sitting safe on my kitchen table right now, and Oliver is going to get every cent of it," of begging for scraps of love, and every single word of that letter. Nothing precious was actually lost today, except perhaps some illusions that badly needed losing. I paused before I went on. Years of begging for scraps of love. And because being calm is the only weapon I have ever found that the people who threw something away can't argue with, he was quiet for a long moment. "Then what do you want to do?" he asked me. "Tell me what you want." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I'll do it. For once in my marriage, I'll do the right thing instead of the easy one, and there it was, the first real spine I had heard in my son's voice in years. It had cost him this much to finally find it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Maybe, I thought, listening to him breathe hard on the other end of that call, it always does. "I want one thing," I told him. "I want the whole family in one room. Your Aunt Rosalind, Vanessa, Diane, if she'll come." Of begging for scraps of love. "And I want to give Oliver his grandfather's gift properly, out loud, where everyone can see exactly what it is and exactly what almost happened to it." I let that sit for a second. "Your father said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Make her open the blanket, so we're going to open the blanket together." Just a little later than planned. What I did not tell Daniel that night, what I would not tell anyone, of begging for scraps of love, not for several more weeks, was the other reason I wanted that entire family gathered in one room at a time and place I controlled completely. Because somewhere underneath the grief over a garbage can of begging for scraps of love, I was still carrying the memory of a coffee shop booth, a stranger named Pamela Voss discussing filing windows in the same tone you'd use to order a sandwich, and a date circled quietly in my own mind that had by then 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not sit idle in those 14 days. I want to walk you through exactly what I did, because it matters that you understand this wasn't instinct or luck. It was training of begging for scraps of love, applied deliberately the same way I'd applied it to 100 other families' messes over 35 years, except this time the mess was mine. The morning after the shower, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I drove to Arthur Castellano's office with the ledger from my sewing room drawer tucked into my handbag alongside a folder of bank statements Walter and I had kept meticulously for decades out of nothing more than old habit. For scraps of love. I told Arthur everything, this time in full. The visits from Vanessa and Diane, the comments about downsizing repeated 4 separate times by 3 different mouths, of begging for scraps of love. The overheard conversation about a capacity route in a filing window, the date, October the 14th, and the fact that I had, quite by accident, come to understand it was now only 14 days away. Begging for scraps of love. Arthur listened the way he always had without interrupting once, his pen moving steadily across a legal pad. 10 years of begging for the pen down, and looked at me over his reading glasses with an expression I hadn't seen on him since the week we'd signed Walter's will. Eleanor, he said, if what you overheard is accurate, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Then someone is attempting to build a documented pattern in advance of filing for a competency evaluation, which is often the first formal step toward a guardianship petition. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that is not something we prevent after the fact. That is something we prevent by moving faster than they are. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He asked me a series of questions I hadn't expected. Whether anyone had recently asked me to sign anything unfamiliar, whether any new doctor's appointments had been scheduled without my full understanding of why, for scraps of love, whether Vanessa or Diane had ever been present during a phone call with my own physician. I answered honestly, and as I answered, of begging for scraps of love, a pattern I hadn't fully assembled in my own mind began to take a shape I could finally see whole. 2 months earlier, Vanessa had accompanied me unasked, and years of begging for scraps of love, to what she'd described as a routine follow-up with my primary doctor, and had spent nearly the entire 15 minutes asking my physician small, seemingly harmless questions about my memory, my sleep, of begging for scraps of love. Whether I'd seemed more forgetful lately, at the time I had read it as concern. I understood now, sitting in Arthur's office with a folder of my own financial history spread across his desk. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I had been reading it wrong the entire time. Arthur moved that same week to establish what he called a durable power of attorney with strict scraps of love. Narrow language naming himself and no one else as my designated agent should any question of capacity ever arise. It's of begging for scraps of love. Supported by a full independent cognitive evaluation from a physician entirely outside my regular practice. Scheduled and completed within days, its results, unambiguous, thorough, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Entirely in my favor, placed permanently on file with his office before anyone else's paperwork could arrive first. He also began drafting the framework for something else. Something I had asked him about on that very first visit weeks earlier, before I'd ever heard the words filing window spoken aloud in a coffee shop. An irrevocable trust. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, structured to hold both the house and a portion of my remaining savings, administered independently, immune to any guardianship petition that might later be filed against me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because a court cannot seize what a person no longer personally owns in the way a guardianship order requires. Arthur explained it to me slowly, patiently, the legal architecture of it, of begging for scraps of love, and I understood perhaps 60% of the technical language and 100% of the underlying point. Whatever Diane and her consultant were building toward on October the 14th, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. They were about to discover they'd been racing toward an empty room. I did not tell Daniel any of this yet. I did not tell Rosalind. I told no one but Arthur, and in the quiet of my own kitchen some evenings, Walter, of begging for scraps of love, who I still talk to more than I probably should admit to a camera. I'm doing exactly what you'd have done, Walter, I told him one night. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting at the same table where his letter had waited inside its blanket for 4 long months. Watch, confirm, move once, and move completely. He used to say that to junior loan officers at the bank decades ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I'd rolled my eyes at it more times than I could count. It had never once occurred to me I'd be the one applying it to save my own house from my own family. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The 19-day countdown I'd overheard in that coffee shop became something I thought about constantly during that stretch, turning the number over the way you'd turn a stone in your pocket. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane and her consultant were, as best I could determine, building their case on precisely the kind of ordinary, forgettable incidents that happen in every household. A forgotten appointment, a slightly repeated story, of begging for scraps of love. A moment of confusion over which day of the week it was after a poor night's sleep, each one small on its own, each one meaningless in isolation, but stacked together and presented to the right judge in the right tone, of begging for scraps of love, capable of painting a picture entirely disconnected from the actual, sharp, entirely capable woman living her actual life. I understood exactly how that kind of documentation worked because I had in a former life of begging for scraps of love reviewed dozens of estate files where family members had done precisely this to elderly relatives whose only real crime had been inconveniently owning something worth taking. I had simply never imagined of begging for scraps of love. Not once in 35 years of reading other people's paperwork that I would end up reading my own. 10 days before the date I'd overheard, I gave Arthur the final go-ahead on the trust of begging for scraps of love, and he filed the paperwork the following morning, along with the independent cognitive evaluation and the narrow ironclad power of attorney. 6 days before the date of begging for scraps of love, a certified letter arrived at my house, not addressed to me directly, interestingly, but to Arthur's office, forwarded on with a note in his own hand attached to the front. It was, he explained when I called him, of begging for scraps of love. A preliminary notice of intent to petition for a limited guardianship, filed on behalf of a concerned family member, is begging for scraps of love, requesting an expedited competency hearing based on documented concerns about my ability to safely manage my own affairs. The concerned family member named on the petition was Diane, not Vanessa, and not Daniel. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a detail I noted and filed away with the same careful attention I'd have given a discrepancy on an estate inventory. Arthur told me not to worry, that the trust and the independent evaluation, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, both unfiled and dated days earlier, would almost certainly be sufficient to have the petition dismissed outright before it ever reached a hearing room, but that I should be prepared regardless. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, for the possibility of a scene. I want to tell you honestly that reading that notice sitting at my own kitchen table, alone in the same chair where I'd once held Walter's letter, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was the single most frightening moment of this entire ordeal for me, more frightening even than the blanket landing in the trash. A blanket, whatever it held inside it, was an object. This was different. It's of begging for scraps of love. This was a piece of paper suggesting, in careful legal language, that the entire life I had built and run competently for 70 years might not, in the eyes of a court, still belong entirely to me. Of begging for scraps of love, I sat with that fear for exactly as long as I needed to feel it, the same way I'd sat with my grief in the car outside Diane's house weeks earlier. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And then I put it in the same drawer where I keep everything else that doesn't serve me, and I went back to work. I had a family gathering to plan for scraps of love, and by then I understood it would need to accomplish 2 things at once, not one. It would need to give Oliver his grandfather's gift properly, exactly as Walter had asked. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it would need to be the room in which Diane and whoever else had been quietly involved in building a case against me learned that the case had already been closed weeks before they'd ever managed to open it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It took several weeks to arrange, partly because there was another matter that needed attending to first, something that changed the entire emotional weather of that stretch of time in ways I hadn't anticipated. For scraps of love. Oliver arrived on a rainy Thursday, 7 pounds and furious about the whole affair, wearing, I am not exaggerating this even slightly, his grandfather's exact frown. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one Walter used to wear over the newspaper on Sunday mornings when the crossword got the better of him. The first time they set that cross little bundle into my arms, of begging for scraps of love. Working himself up steadily toward a full-throated holler, I saw Walter so clearly in that small, indignant face that I had to sit down right there in the hospital chair before my knees gave out on their own. Of begging for scraps of love, there you are, I whispered to him, so quietly I don't think anyone else in the room heard it. We've been saving up for you for a very long time, little man. The baby softened something in everyone. Of begging for scraps of love. At least for a while, even Vanessa, who arrived at the hospital, exhausted and unfiltered in a way I hadn't seen from her in years, the careful aesthetic temporarily forgotten under sleeplessness and spit up and the raw scraps of love. Unglamorous work of keeping a newborn alive. For a handful of days, I let myself hope genuinely of begging for scraps of love, that the family gathering I'd been quietly planning might not even prove necessary, that the baby would simply melt the whole ugly business on his own. But then, about a week later, begging for scraps of love. Vanessa posted the first photograph of Oliver to her page, staged, filtered, dressed in an outfit that likely cost more than his own crib blanket, captioned with a string of brand names, and I understood, of begging for scraps of love, looking at it on my phone at my kitchen table, that the softness had only ever been a phase and that the underlying architecture hadn't shifted an inch. Oliver was already being measured for the same small, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Invisible price tags his mother had been raised inside from birth, which meant Walter's gift and Walter's letter, and everything I had spent the past several weeks quietly building around them mattered more than ever. 10 years of begging for scraps of less. I sent the invitations myself, by hand, the old-fashioned way. Sunday dinner, my house, everyone welcome. I got out the blanket, washed clean now, the last traces of that trash can finally gone from the wool, of begging for scraps of love. The sailboats, bright again, Walter's initials still tucked quietly into their corner. And I waited for the day I had, by then, already begun to think of not as a confrontation, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but as an accounting, the kind I'd conducted for other families 100 times over the course of my career, except this time every single line item on the ledger belonged to me. They came on a Sunday evening, begging for scraps of love, into a house that smelled like the pot roast I'd spent the afternoon making, of begging for scraps of love, because some battles are easier fought on a full stomach, and I intended to make sure nobody in that dining room had an excuse to say they'd been ambushed on an empty one. Daniel arrived first, gray around the eyes, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, carrying Oliver against his shoulder like something he was afraid to set down. Vanessa came in, polished again, wary, scanning the room the way she used to scan a room for cameras. Of begging for scraps of love, Diane arrived because missing it would have looked worse in the end than attending, and Rosalind came early as she'd promised. Years of begging for scraps of love, to help me in the kitchen and to stand at my shoulder like the sister Walter would have wanted there, beside me. I had set the table carefully, and in the center of it, where a centerpiece would ordinarily sit, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I had laid the blanket, clean now, folded with the hidden pocket facing up, the sailboat's bright, Walter's initials tucked quietly into their corner. Vanessa's eyes went to it the instant she stepped through the door, of begging for scraps of love, and her face did something complicated. I don't think she'd expected to see it again. I think some part of her had hoped it would simply, quietly disappear, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way uncomfortable things tend to for people who are used to having their discomfort managed for them by someone else. We ate first. I insisted on it, gently but firmly, of begging for scraps of love, because you don't do the hard thing on an empty stomach, and I wanted everyone settled and fed and entirely unable to claim afterward that they'd been caught off guard. We talked about the baby. It was, for a while, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Almost pleasant, Vanessa even thanked me for the pot roast and seemed genuinely surprised to find that she meant it. Then I cleared the plates myself, waving off Daniel's offer to help, and sat back down, of begging for scraps of love, and put one hand flat on the blanket in the center of the table. I'd like to give Oliver his gift from his grandfather now, I said, properly this time, the way Walter asked me to before he died, of begging for scraps of love. The table went very still. Daniel's jaw tightened. Diane set down her wineglass with a small, deliberate click. Vanessa went carefully, thoroughly blank, of begging for scraps of love, the particular blankness of someone for a blow she suspects is coming, but doesn't yet know the exact shape of. Vanessa, I said, and I kept my voice warm and steady and not unkind, as of begging for scraps of love, though I imagine that steadiness was the thing that unsettled her most. You held this blanket a few weeks ago, and you decided all by yourself what it was worth, as of begging for scraps of love, and you threw it away in front of 20 people and a camera. I'd like to show you, and everyone here, exactly what you were holding. Before I opened it, of begging for scraps of love, I want you to know something I only told Daniel weeks after that dinner, but I'll tell you now because it belongs here. That afternoon at the shower, of begging for scraps of love. In the half-second before Vanessa lifted the blanket toward the trash can, her fingers had grazed along the bottom hem, right along the seam, right over the hidden pocket, and paused there, just barely, of begging for scraps of love, for perhaps half a second longer than they needed to. I saw it happen from my chair across the room and thought, at the time, that she'd simply felt the weight of good wool. She had been, quite literally, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, one small curious touch away from finding $52,000 and her son's grandfather's last letter herself in front of everyone entirely on her own. She never made that touch. For scraps of love, contempt has a way of moving faster than curiosity, and it cost her, that afternoon, far more than she understood at the time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I picked up the small seam ripper I'd carried in from my sewing room and set it beside the blanket on the table, the same tool I had used 10,000 times over 35 years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same tool I'd used to check the pocket the night of the shower. I opened it slowly, deliberately, in front of all of them, of begging for scraps of love, the little blade sliding cleanly through the stitches I had sewn with such care 4 long months earlier. Then I drew the contents out and laid them on the clean tablecloth, one item at a time, of begging for scraps of love, the way a banker might count out a fortune in front of witnesses, which is, in point of fact, precisely what I was doing. These, I said, setting down the thick rubber-banded stack, are United States savings bonds, of begging for scraps of love. Your father bought them, Daniel, a few at a time, on birthdays and bonuses, for almost 30 years, starting the year you turned 9. The envelope in his closet said, for our first grandbaby. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I smoothed my palm across the stack once. They came due this year. They're worth just over $52,000. The number went around that table like a cold draft moving through an open door. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane's mouth fell open. Vanessa had gone very pale. And this, I said, setting down a sealed envelope with the same careful gentleness you'd use setting down a sleeping child, of begging for scraps of love, is the last letter your husband ever wrote, Daniel. He dictated it to me in his hospital bed. It's for Oliver to open on his 18th birthday so that a boy who will never meet his grandfather can sit down one day, of begging for scraps of love 20 years from now and hear from him anyway. I touched the edge of the envelope. Your father's exact words to me near the very end were, "Make her open the blanket. Make it last." I looked up directly at Vanessa. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I kept my voice as gentle as I have ever managed to keep it, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. This is what you held in your hands at that shower, I said. $52,000, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the final words of a dying man. This is what you called homemade. This is what you dropped in a trash can on camera in front of 20 people because it didn't match your aesthetic. Nobody at that table breathed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Brianna's video, I knew, was still sitting out there in the world somewhere, and everyone in that room knew it too, whether or not anyone said so out loud. Vanessa did what Vanessa has always done when cornered, of begging for scraps of love. She reached immediately for the version of the story in which she was the victim. "You can't put this on me," she said, her voice climbing thin and fast. "How was I supposed to know?" Of begging for scraps of love. Who sews $50,000 into a blanket and doesn't say anything? That's a trap, basically. You set me up. "I didn't set you up, Vanessa," I said, still calm. "Your husband's father asked for scraps of love with his dying breath, that the gift be hidden in something handmade, so it would be treasured instead of spent. I honored him. I assumed wrongly, I'll grant you that much, of begging for scraps of love, that no one would throw a handmade blanket in the garbage. That assumption was my only mistake in this whole business. The throwing was entirely yours. It was a joke," she said. It was for the camera. For scraps of love." "I know," I said gently. "That's rather the whole problem, isn't it?" Deanne started to say something. "Now, that's not fair. She's a new mother. And I turned my eyes to her only once, begging for scraps of love, and let the silence do most of the talking. "Diane," I said, "we'll get to you in just a moment. I'd sit this one out if I were you." Diane sat it out. Then I told them what I had already decided, of begging for scraps of love, because mercy and consequence, I've learned, can share the same table without contradicting each other. "Here is what happens now," I said. "Oliver gets every cent of it. Walter saved it for the baby. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the baby will have it." I laid my hand flat on the bonds, but not the way it was originally meant to be given. I can't hand an open inheritance to a household that throws legacies in the trash for content. Begging for scraps of love. So this money goes into a locked education trust, administered independently, for Oliver and Oliver alone, for his schooling, for his start in life. It cannot be spent, borrowed against, or touched by anyone else. Of begging for scraps of love. Not by Vanessa. Not by you, Daniel. Not by me, Daniel nodded slowly. I saw, with a small ache underneath everything else, that he understood exactly why the locking included him, and that he didn't argue. Of begging for scraps of love, because he knew he'd earned the exclusion the moment he chose silence over his father's honor at that shower. "And the blanket," I went on, "comes home with me tonight." Of begging for scraps of love. Oliver can have it. Once I'm satisfied, it will be honored properly in the house he grows up in, and not one day before. A thing isn't safe in a home that never learned it was precious in the first place. Is begging for scraps of love. Vanessa opened her mouth to protest. The blanket, I think, of everything, which tells you exactly how little she'd absorbed even then. And Daniel, my quiet, gentle, peacekeeping son, finally spoke, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a voice I had genuinely never heard him use with her before. "Vanessa," he said, just her name, but carrying a weight I hadn't heard from him in years. "Don't. Not one more word. Not about the blanket." Of begging for scraps of love. Not about whose fault this was. Not one more word. And Vanessa, for the first time since I had known her, closed her mouth and kept it closed. Of begging for scraps of love. It had taken $52,000 and a dead man's letter to finally give my son a spine. Better late, I thought, than never at all. There was one more piece of business left, and it was, in its way, of begging for scraps of love. The more dangerous one for me personally, though it had nothing to do with the blanket at all. "I want to talk about the house now," I said. And I watched Diane go very still across the table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I know a little about what's been happening these past several months. I know about the visits and the comments about downsizing, repeated 4 separate times by 3 different people inside of 6 weeks. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I know about a conversation I happened to overhear at the coffee shop on 5th Street between you, Diane, and a woman named Pamela Voss about a filing window and a capacity route. In for scraps of love. I know the date you were working toward. October the 14th, Diane's face went through several colors in quick succession, none of them good. Daniel turned toward her, and then toward Vanessa. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with an expression I don't think either of them had ever seen on him before. Not hurt this time, but something closer to disbelief curdling fast into anger. "You knew about this," he said to Vanessa quietly, "of begging for scraps of love. You let your mother, while I was sitting there worrying about a blanket, you were—" I let that hang a moment before I went on, because Daniel deserved to feel the shape of it fully before I finished. "Of begging for scraps of love. I want to be very clear with everyone at this table," I said. "I am not confused. I am not forgetful. I am not a woman who needs anyone's permission to manage her own life, her own house, or her own money. 2 weeks ago, of begging for scraps of love, my attorney filed an independent cognitive evaluation on my behalf conducted by a physician entirely outside my regular practice, along with a narrow power of attorney naming only him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and an irrevocable trust protecting this house and the remainder of my savings from exactly the kind of petition that was quietly filed against me 6 days ago." I paused and let my voice stay level. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, though it cost me something to keep it that way. That petition has already been dismissed. There will be no hearing. There is nothing left for anyone to find. I want you to imagine for a moment of begging for scraps of love, being the person who spent months carefully building a case, only to learn the room you were racing toward had already been closed and locked before you'd even finished drawing your plans. Diane's face did exactly that. Of begging for scraps of love. If any of that is unclear to you tonight, or if you've ever felt the ground shift under you the way she did in that moment, tell me in the comments, because I promise you, this part of the story isn't finished yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "Diane," I said, when the silence had gone on long enough, "I understand you love your daughter, and I understand, in your own way, you thought you were protecting her family's future. Of begging for big scraps of love. But you tried to take my home out from under me while I was still walking, talking, cooking Sunday dinners, and grieving my husband, and I want you to sit with something before you say another word tonight." Of begging for scraps of love. 9 years ago, before Vanessa ever met my son, before any of us knew each other at all, she was 3 weeks from losing her first shop. I paused. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and watched Vanessa's face shift from confusion into something else entirely. "I know that," I went on, "because I paid 3 months of her back rent myself, anonymously, through her landlord's office, of begging for scraps of love, and never told a single soul, not even my own husband, because it wasn't given so it could be repaid. I still have the receipt in a ledger in my sewing room if anyone would like to see it." I looked at Vanessa directly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You built the life you have now on top of a kindness you never knew you'd received, from a woman your mother just tried to have declared incompetent so she could take her house. I have never, before or since, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, watched a room go quite that quiet. There was one more thing left, the thing that mattered most of all, the reason for every other document, every other decision. Your father left one more piece for us, of begging for scraps of love. I said to Daniel, my voice softening now all the way down to the register I reserved for him alone. He didn't know, when he dictated it, exactly what shape the day would take when it finally came. But he asked me to read it aloud the first time the family truly understood what was inside that blanket, whatever the circumstances turned out to be. I took a second. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Smaller envelope from the pocket of my cardigan, one I had kept separately, at home, never sewn into the lining, waiting for precisely this evening. My hands shook a little opening it, not from the arthritis this time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If you're hearing this, I read, then the day has finally come, and I'm sorry I couldn't be standing there to make a nuisance of myself about it. 10 years begging for scraps of love. I've been putting this money aside for the little one since Daniel was 9 years old, because the best thing my own grandfather ever gave me wasn't money at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was the proof that somebody had been thinking of me long before I ever existed to be thought of. That's what's sewn into this blanket. Proof that you were wanted, little one. Of begging for scraps of love by an old man who never got the chance to meet you. Spend it on something that lasts, and whatever else happens. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Be the kind of family that knows the difference between what a thing costs and what a thing is actually worth. Your grandmother does. Learn it from her. All my love, Walter. Of begging for scraps of love. The room stayed silent a long moment after I finished. Rosalind was weeping openly by then. Daniel had his face pressed to the crown of his sleeping son's head, his shoulders shaking. Of begging for scraps of love. And Vanessa was looking at the blanket on the table, the one she'd thrown away, and for the first time, I believe, actually seeing it. It was too late for that particular look to count as forgiveness. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But it might, just possibly, have been the beginning of learning how to look at things properly. I want you to know what happened in the months after that dinner, because I know some of you want the full ledger. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not just the feeling. The trust is quietly growing. $52,000 doing exactly what Walter intended it to do, patiently, the way Walter himself always did everything. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Oliver cannot touch it until he's grown, and neither can anyone else, and that, in the end, is the entire point. Walter thought in decades. Now, so does his grandson's future, Brianna's video of begging for scraps of love. The one showing Vanessa dropping the blanket and saying we only display curated things in this family had already been seen by more of the family than Vanessa ever realized long before that dinner. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She deleted it from her own page the day Daniel finally told her the truth, but the internet keeps what it's given, and enough people had already seen it that Vanessa spent a long, quiet season being known of begging for scraps of love in her own circle as the woman who threw away her son's inheritance for a laugh. I never sent it to anyone. She filmed it herself. There is a lesson in that, too, about a life lived for an audience. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The guardianship petition was dismissed within a week of the trust filing, quietly, without a hearing, exactly as Arthur had predicted. Diane and I are not close, and I doubt we ever will be, of begging for scraps of love, but she has stopped commenting on square footage in front of me, which I count, privately, as something like a diplomatic victory. Vanessa has never fully apologized to me, not in the complete of begging for scraps of love, unqualified way I think she'd need to in order for me to fully trust her again. She isn't built for that yet and possibly never will be. But she asked me a few weeks after that dinner of begging for scraps of love, in a small and genuinely uncertain voice whether I would teach her to knit. I said yes. We have since made one lopsided, uneven, entirely wonderful little hat together for Oliver, her very first handmade object. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She kept it. She did not throw it away. It is a start, and I have learned at 70 years old to let a start be a start without demanding it arrive already finished. Daniel is the one who changed the most. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Grief and shame accomplished in him what 40 years of comfortable living never could. They grew him a backbone. He came to see me alone about a month after that dinner of begging for scraps of love and sat at the same kitchen table where the blanket had once waited inside its trash can smell and told me he'd been replaying the whole shower over and over and kept landing on the same conclusion. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I didn't fail Dad when I let that blanket go in the trash, he told me. I failed him 100 times before that. Every single time I stayed quiet just to keep Vanessa comfortable. Of begging for scraps of love. The blanket was just the one time I finally couldn't unsee it. That's a hard thing to learn about yourself, I told him. You knew it about me for years, he said. Why didn't you ever say something? Of begging for scraps of love. Because some things a person has to find for themselves, I told him. I could have told you 1,000 times. It took a blanket in a bin to make you actually believe it. He is different now. He speaks up at work. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. At home, in rooms where his silence used to be the default setting, he and Vanessa have started seeing a counselor together, which I genuinely never thought I'd live to see. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He keeps one of his father's old flannel shirts hanging by his own front door, but he's told Oliver, on more than one occasion already, that he intends to teach him to fish himself the way his father would have. For scraps of love, I'm still learning how not to choose easier, he told me recently. But I'm choosing it on purpose now. That part is new. It is, and I am prouder of him for it than I know how to say plainly. Of begging for scraps of love. The blanket lives on Oliver's crib now. It took several months before I brought it over. long enough for me to be reasonably certain the house it was going into had actually learned something, even a little. 10 years of begging for scraps of love about what it had once been holding. When I finally carried it in, Vanessa had cleared a place of honor for it on the wall above the crib, and she'd taken down the designer throw that used to hang there. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she didn't say a single word about aesthetics the entire time. She simply watched me lay Walter's sailboats over her sleeping son, and then she touched the corner where his initials sat and said quietly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I never even noticed that was there. Most people don't, I told her. You have to know to look for it. My hands are worse this winter than they were even a year ago. Some mornings the needles simply win. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and there's no knitting to be had at all. But I am making Oliver a sweater slowly. A few rows on the good days, with his grandfather's initials hidden once more in the cuff, where he'll find them someday. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, if somebody teaches him to know where to look, because that is what people like me do. We sew ourselves into things quietly, and then we wait. Walter taught me that, over 43 years of marriage, of begging for scraps of love, long before I ever needed to use it against my own family. Time pays interest on patience, he used to tell me. I believe that more now than I ever did while he was alive to say it to me himself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If there is one thing I would hand to you out of all of this, it is this. The world will keep telling you, louder every single year, that a thing's worth is something you can read off a label. Of begging for scraps of love, that the expensive gift is the real one, and the handmade one is sweet perhaps, but lesser. Don't believe a word of it. The most valuable things in any room are almost always the quiet ones, made by someone's hands. Of begging for scraps of love, given without a single logo attached to them. And they are, for exactly that reason, the easiest things in the world to throw away if you were never taught how to look properly in the first place. Years of begging for scraps of love. I spent 70 years learning that lesson through the fabric of other people's lives before I ever had to apply it to my own. I hope you don't have to wait quite that long to learn it for yourselves. For scraps of love, I'm 70 years old. I live alone in a house that is at last entirely and permanently mine, in every sense a piece of paper can make true. Some evenings it is still very quiet in here, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I still talk to Walter more than I probably should admit on a camera, and I have made my peace with both of those facts. But I am not of begging for scraps of love. Whatever a garbage can or a coffee shop conversation once tried to suggest about me, a woman anyone gets to underestimate twice. That's my story. One homemade blanket, one trash can, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. One house nearly taken out from under me by people who should have protected it, and a love that turned out to be worth infinitely more than the whole curated room put together. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If it reminded you of a handmade gift you still treasure or a moment someone underestimated exactly the wrong woman, tell them tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.